it. First of all, thank you so much for braving this insane rainstorm to be here tonight. But and we're so happy you could be here for Q and Columbia College Women's evening with our special guest, New York Times bestselling author Melissa de la Cruz. So, Melissa, we're going to start at the beginning. You wanted to be a writer since you were a little girl, and why did you have this burning desire?
I think it's funny. I actually think like knowing what you want to be when you're so little, and also just always wanting to be that, is actually a gift. And I never really saw it that way, because for me, living through it, that was just all I wanted. Like, I love to read. So the minute I learned how to read, I remember being really interested in books, interested in story. Like, I remember reading all of Dr. Seuss. I remember reading fairy tales, nursery rhymes. So when I was 8 years old, I put together a book for my mom. It was a book of poems, and it was illustrated, and it was called Bears, Bears Everywhere. Bears, Bears Here and There. That was very clever. But I just remember like feeling like, oh, I like this. I like reading. I like writing. I like telling stories. And that's all I've ever really liked doing. And the joke in my family is I can't do anything else. I'm terrible at everything. My daughter is 17 and just learned how to drive. So we had this little sticker that said student driver on the car, on my car, and we just kept it on for me because I am literally, I like, people follow me out of the highway and park next to me. And I remember this guy did that, and I was in the Eagle Rock Mall, and I was like, why have you followed me to the Filipino Mall? And he like rapped on my door, and I was like, what is happening? But he was this nice Asian man, and he said, ma'am, you're a terrible driver. And I was like, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry, I don't know how to drive. But so writing and telling stories is just the only thing I really know how to do that I'm good at. And I knew I was good at it really young, and I think it's part of like wanting to tell stories, but also like feeling like you're good at it. It was also why I kept doing it. So I think like once I got feedback from my teachers, really like as early as like, elementary school, having people tell me, wow, you're really good at this. You're a really good writer. You're a really good essayist. You're a really good storyteller. So that just, made my confidence so much more. So I just remember that I was always good at that. I was always good at books. I was always good at writing. And then in high school, trying to write a novel, writing poetry. I was also an artist. And before I went to Columbia, I remember thinking, like, do I do art and go to RISD, or do I go to Columbia? And my dad said, you're going to Columbia. No, no discussion, But it was funny because at that point I kind of understood like who I was as an artist. Like, I really like telling stories more than anything. And I think having the audacity to do that, and just believing in yourself, but also having feedback from, your teachers, your friends, your, kind of workshopping people. Like, I always knew I was clever, and I knew I was clever with words. So I don't know. I do think it's kind of like this, it's a gift, I can't even really explain it. Like, I always liked it, and it turned out I was good at it. So I just kept doing it, and I never really did anything else. So.
So, in my research, Melissa, I also unearthed that when you were 11, you found out that the ghostwriters of Sweet Valley High were in their 20s,
Yes.
which very much encouraged you. So, can you expand on that?
Yes, absolutely. So I grew up in Manila in the Philippines, and my parents were bankers, and everybody, we didn't know any writers, or authors. We didn't know any authors. I thought all authors were either 90 years old or dead. I didn't really see it as something that people who were alive were doing. And when I was 11, I read a newspaper account of these ghostwriters who were these young women who were 22. And I remember I was 11, and I thought, oh my goodness, I'm 11, they're 22. If in 11 years I could be doing what they're doing. So it was really the first time that I saw writing as a profession. It was about Sweet Valley High. It was about Francine Pascal, who had created Sweet Valley High. And so her name was on the cover of the books, but when you opened the book, it said, whatever, Double Love by Kate Williams, created by Francine Pascal. So, that's when I kind of understood, like, oh, it's a business, and that really, like, kind of made me think, oh, maybe one day I could do this. I didn't have to do, what my parents did. I could maybe, do writing as a career.
So you've said that for your first book, it took you 5 years and 2 weeks to write. What does that mean exactly? And also, can you talk about how after college you took a day job in finance and you wrote your first book on the side?
Yeah, you did a lot of research, Kathy. So actually, I always joke that it took. So I wanted to be a writer when I was eight, and I sold my first book at 27. So I always say it took 21 years and 2 weeks to sell my first book. So when I graduated from Columbia at 22, I thought, okay, I'm gonna try to be a writer, but I also need to live in New York. So I took a day job. I got recruited out of the college, and I was actually a computer programmer, if you can believe it. And my boss said he liked to hire English majors because it was easier to teach computer programming to an English major than it was to teach how to talk to people, to computer programmers. So he went the other way, and he hired liberal arts kids, which I thought was so funny. So you kind of so that was my day job, and then kind of on the side, and let's just be honest, during work I wrote my novel. And it took about 5 years. So from 22 to 27, it took 5 years to sell my first novel, which was actually not my first written novel. So at 22, I sent my book out to I didn't know anybody. I had no contacts, even though I graduated from Columbia. How does anybody get a publishing deal? How does anybody become an author? It was still very murky and very mysterious. And so I thought, well, I know how to read, so I can go to a bookstore. So there was actually a book at the bookstore called The Writer's Market, and The Writer's Market listed all these agents, and one of the main pieces of advice that it said you should have an agent because there's a lot of publishing houses that don't look at unagented manuscripts. You just go straight to the slush pile. So I said, okay, so I need an agent. So I sent it to about 24 agents, and of the 24 agents, about 6 agents said, oh, we want to read the whole book. And I said, oh, I have to write the whole book, because I was always kind of hedging my bets. And then I sent it to the 6, and 4 of the 6 offered to represent me. And I picked the most experienced one, and he was an older gentleman who had sold Auntie Mame. That was his, claimed fame, was he sold Auntie Mame in the 50s. He was a really nice old guy. He actually wasn't able to sell my first novel. But what happened was, after I met Ray, he sent it out to enough editors, and there was an editor at Simon & Schuster, Jeff Klosky, who's now the head of Riverhead, and he's the publisher of The Kite Runner and whatever won the National Book Award. That's his book. It's like, oh, congratulations, Jeff. You also discovered me. Yeah. And Jeff took me out to lunch and said, the first thing he said was, I'm not buying your novel. And then I thought, I was 25. I was like, is this a date? I was kind of like, But he actually said, nobody's going to buy a novel from somebody who's never even written professionally. So he advised me to write for magazines, newspapers in New York, get a clip file, and then work on a new novel. So I did that with Jeff's advice, and that's kind of how I got started. And 5 years later, when I was out with my third written novel, and I think it was my 4th agent at the time, because, after Ray couldn't sell my book, I tried to find another agent. They couldn't sell my second book. And then my third agent kind of didn't work out. So it was my 4th agent. And she sent it out, and I was at a meeting, because I was a computer programmer and we had clients. So I was at a corporate meeting, and my cell phone buzzed under the table, and I just knew, I was like, oh my God, this is it. And I always have to tell the story and say that it was the third happiest day of my life when my agent called me 2 weeks later to say we'd sold my novel to Simon Schuster, after my wedding and the birth of my child. But since they're not here right now, I can be completely honest. When I got that phone call that Simon Schuster was buying my novel, it was the happiest day of my life. So,
As it should be. I love that, Melissa. So you were always a very high achieving student. You were salutatorian of your high school. You, of course, went to Columbia College, where you majored in art history and English. And you've said when you were writing, you had to sometimes unlearn some of the more academic training and teach yourself to write more commercially. So obviously, you've written 70 books now. A lot of them are bestsellers. So what are the commercial considerations that you think about when you're writing your novels?
oh, that's such a good question. I don't know if I should reveal all my secrets. I think people don't really. I think the mechanics of writing is something that we don't teach. Like there's a lot of like kind of technical things that go into writing a novel, almost like a screenplay. So a lot of commercial fiction writers use a lot of screenplay kind of structures to write their novels, which I think is good to a point. But what? But I think if you're writing commercial fiction, which I did not realize because I remember, and I don't think I even thought about it in that way. My first novel was for adults. It was reviewed in New Yorker. I wanted to be a writer. I didn't really think about genre at that point. But what was shocking to me was that if you wanted to keep on writing books and making money off books and not having a day job, having the kind of life that Stephen King has, you actually have to have readers and you have to have an audience and your books actually have to sell. Like, I never actually thought about that part, I didn't realize that it would have to connect with people. And I think that that's something that commercial fiction really does, is like it connects with people's emotions, with their feelings. The more people feel when they read your books, kind of like the bigger, kind of impact and audience it has. Like one of my friends wrote If I Stay, Gail Foreman, which is about something that happened to, her family. Her best friend's family was killed in a car accident. She put her grief into this book. And I remember we would all have t-shirts that said like all the feels, it sold like, millions and millions of copies. And I think that's what commercial fiction does, which I think maybe, when we teach literature, we don't really, I think that's something that not frowned upon, but, I definitely went into my career saying, I will never write a romance. Oh my God, what? Ew. That's so tacky. I'm literally writing the biggest romantasy book right now. I'm so excited. So,
Oh, good. Well, thank you for telling us some of your secrets.
Okay.
So, of course, we're here to celebrate a book that came out last year, which is Going Dark. I love this book. I thought it was incredible. I stayed up past my bedtime a couple of nights, like tearing through it. My husband found me and was like, what are you doing? And I was like, I have to find out what happened.
Aww.
Okay. And so I wanted to talk about what was the genesis of Going Dark? Like, what, how did you get the idea and how did you kind of dive into the book?
So when I was so sometimes ideas come and then, it takes 10 years for it to kind of germinate in your head. I had a book called The Birthday Girl, which was my other adult thriller that came out a couple of years before this that literally I thought about for 10 years. I kept talking about it. And my husband finally said, you just got to write that book. I'm tired of hearing about it. I'm like, okay. So that was like a 10-year book. But Going Dark actually came from... it's kind of inspired by kind of a sad thing that happened, in the news. It was inspired by the Gabby Petito story. And what inspired it was I was so kind of fascinated by how kind of the internet and the public helped solve that mystery. Like we were all just so interested in the story that somebody went through their GoPros during, whatever, the canyon and found, and I don't know, you guys all know, right, what happened. Like she was with her boyfriend. They were doing a road trip through Utah and the national parks. And then he came back without her and said, well, I don't know what happened to her, So, and so I was just fascinated by the fact that we found out kind of what happened to her through, kind of internet detective it's, like the public. So I thought, what if something like that happened? And then I thought, there was also something kind of in the news about, missing white women syndrome, like women of color. Often when they go missing, there's not, because it was just so crazy, Gabby Petito. It was like, it was everywhere. Like, you could not open the New York Times, the New York Post, Vanity Fair. Like, it was just everywhere on the internet. Everybody was obsessed with her. And I just thought, well, what if it was somebody, who didn't look like her, or somebody who looked like her but actually wasn't like her? So then I thought about missing white women syndrome, and then it was also kind of inspired by a pair of sisters that I knew growing up, who were half white and half Filipino, and one of the sisters looked very, very white, and one of the sisters looked very Asian. And so I think if I didn't know about them, I'm probably kind of giving it away a little bit, spoiling my own book. But like, what if that something happened in that kind of realm? And then my daughter was really interested in all these travel influencers, and I was just so sick of them, so I had to put them in my book.
Well, what I also loved about the book is, even though you're exploring missing white woman syndrome, you're not being preachy about it, and it's a very entertaining book. And then after you read it, you're like, oh my God, I was so entertained, but then it is very thought-provoking. Okay. So how do you mix like the sugar in with the medicine, I guess, of like, this is like kind of what drew your attention and incensed you to make you write the book, but then you're not reading it being like, oh my God, Melissa's just preaching to us.
Yeah. Oh, good. Well, I mean, I think you have to entertain. I think it has to be an entertaining story. And mostly I try to entertain myself. So there's always going to be sugar. It's always going to be fun to read. And it's always going to be something that I'm interested in. And I think that's how I've kind of worked as a genre writer. I wrote a very long series called Blue Bloods, which was this big vampire series that I think there's like 19 books in all, with all the spin-offs and everything. And I always wonder, like, how did I keep my interest in this story that went over all these books? And every book I thought, oh, I'm really interested in the history of Versailles, so I'm going to put that in this book. I'm really interested in the pyramids. I'm going to put that in this book. So I would always kind of find ways to put things that I was interested in the genre construct. And I think with Going Dark, I wanted to kind of write about, being in Italy. I was like, oh, I put Italy in the book, and being in college. So the sugar is not hard for me to do.
Okay. So I wanted to talk about your Disney imprint, which launched in 2022, which is phenomenal. Melissa de la Cruz Studio. Can you talk about your vision for the imprint and how you source writers? Because I know it's important that you source acclaimed writers as well as rising star writers.
Yeah, so I've been with Disney, I think, 21 years now. I think I've been there longer than many of the executives who were there. So I'm like, well, I've been here longer. That's what we do. And so I was kind of a house writer. I did Blue Bloods with them, and then we did Descendants. And I had a small packaging company. So a book packaging company is when you produce the book. It's kind of like the way TV is, but it's books. So you find a writer, we have an idea, we find a writer, we put it together, we sell it. So I had like a tiny kind of small packaging company that I was doing on the side for books that I, not that I couldn't write, but maybe things that I was like interested in, but I didn't have the time for. So we would find writers to do it. So we kind of had this kind of small side business. And then we wanted to make it bigger. So it's, it's kind of my sensibility. It's my sense of humor. It's, kind of my ideas. And sometimes it's books that, we have we call it our gay magician fantasy project that came out. It's called The Spells We Cast by Jason June. And I really wanted to read about kind of dueling gay magicians, but I also wanted it to be written by, somebody who was from that background. I didn't think that I was the best person to write that. So sometimes it's like books like that where, I want to read that book, but I'm not the writer for it. Or we'll have ideas that I don't have time for. But it's mostly, to kind of bring, kind of these fun, it's, I think the tagline Disney came up with was fun, fabulous, feel-good stories. So that's what the studio is about. And we have a historical fiction that's coming out next year that's based on these three sisters who were very famous in the 19th century for being psychics, and they actually were defrauded. We found out, well, of course, it was not true, but, people really believed in it. And so I thought, well, what if it's true? What if the Fox sisters actually could speak to the dead? What would that be like? So it's, so it's kind of stuff like that I'm interested in, but don't have time to write, because it's an IP company. So it's creating intellectual property for Disney.
And so a question I had is, I'm sure you get recommended a lot of authors that have already published books, but then I know you're also searching for new voices. So then how do you find these new voices that aren't published yet?
So my agent, he goes out and he goes to Iowa and he goes to all the kind of MFA programs. And I think there's always like a day where they meet people and like we get submissions, but it is a very closed loop. We go out to other agents and they pitch us writers. So, yeah, so we kind of do it that way.
Okay. Very nice. So Melissa, you've written over 70 books and you write 5 books a year. This volume is staggering. Okay. Please tell us your writing and productivity tips.
Oh, well, I publish 3 to 5 books a year. And then I don't really know how many books I write, because it's kind of like everything's kind of overlapping. But, I always joke that, on my gravestone it'd be like always on deadline, because I am actually always I'm on deadline right now, you guys. Like I have a book due on Friday and I was coming over in the car being like, all right, I'm going to do this event. I don't know. I actually think it's part of my procrastination and it's part of how I deal with writer's block. And I think I've kind of understood now how I work because I always work on the book that's not due. So it never feels stressful. So I never want to work on the book that's due on Friday. I want to work on the book that's due next year, and I kind of have to force myself to work on the book that's due because that's way too stressful and scary. I don't know. I think like I like to work, and it also doesn't feel like work. It feels just like telling a story that I've done, ever since I was, 8 years old. So it feels like play, and it feels really fun. I'm just kind of like writing and laughing, myself, and I have books that did really well, and I have books that don't, and I worked on them just as much, and I love them just as much, and I was like, oh, so it's nice when people agree with me, and I'm like, oh, that's great, it's a hit. What about this other book? I like this one too. No, but I think that's really important is that you just write for yourself. You don't think about the audience really, and I think as a YA and a kid lit writer, I do think I felt very much like a teenager for a long time. Not so much now that I have a real teenager, which is I think why I kind of write middle grade and adult now. I'm kind of leaving the teenage years, to her to experience. So I feel like somebody has to be a grown up, and I guess that's me.
So my co-president Austin and I did. We went to an event for a thriller that came out last year that came out. The Headmaster's List. It was an escape room event. So if you were a fan of some of these thriller authors, you got to do an escape room event with them, and we broke out of prison with Melissa.
I was so unhelpful though. I don't think I solved one puzzle.
Also, I
just kind of stood around.
Yes, I had never done an escape room, and Austin was like, "This is what you do. You have to search this." And I was like,
Austin was on it.
But so I wanted to ask you, what is the craziest thing you've done to promote one of your books?
Oh, I mean that's probably up there. Yeah, thankfully nothing too weird, like other authors have these like Cassie Clare, who writes kind of romance fantasy books. She had like fans who were so angry about what happened, in one of her books. Like she literally got attacked. Like somebody slammed a book on her hand at a signing. And I was like, oh, that's terrible. And then after that she got bodyguards and all that. But yeah. Or just like, just kind of like not inappropriate, kind of proposals, I would say. You know, some of my other friends who are romance writers, I was like, I never had any of that. My fans are great, you know. I think what I remember, the one weird thing that happened was one of my fans almost got run over by somebody in a wheelchair at the book convention because somebody was so excited to get there, it almost ran over Amanda. I was like, lady, you know. But we've done like Disney. We did a bunch of like raffles. We would fly out and we had dinner with one of the fans who won. And yeah, no,
This is
we
on
haven't
brand.
done-
They're all very respectful.
There is very
Yes.
respectful. I mean, the Descendants fans are so cute. You know, they're 8 to 12 years old. They're awesome. You know, and then I guess I had like for a while I had like a lot of prison fans. And one of them actually came to one of my events and he was a very nice man. But you know, my publicist at the publishing house was like, we're a little scared, you know. Says he just got out of prison, wants to meet you. I'm like, it's fine, it's okay, you know. And I got a lot of mail also from when I was writing the Blue Blood series, which is about, you know, these group of kids who fight you know, terrible vampires. And during Hurricane Katrina, you know, a lot of people were saying like, you know, your books got me through some really hard times. So I had a lot of military mail and a lot of people who suffered from trauma, which was very moving. You know, it makes you feel like, okay, you know, I'm glad that, you know, these stories are taking them out of, you know, whatever hard thing that they're going through in their life. So
That's amazing.
yeah.
So I wanted to close out, Melissa, by asking what you have coming up that you're really excited about, because you're always working on so many different things.
Yeah, so I do have a big romantasy coming out. It feels like you know, Blue Bloods was really fun. I wrote that 20 years ago, the first book. So it feels just as new and fresh as that. And it's adult. So it's my first kind of very adult romance mixed with fantasy. So I'm calling it kind of my sexy Lord of the Rings book. Do with that as you may. Let your imaginations go wild. I did. So
Very good pitch, yes.
I can't announce it yet. We haven't announced it. So.
So we do have time for a couple audience questions. If one or two people want to ask Melissa something, I'm happy to. Okay, great.
Hi, I'm Marilyn.
Hi.
It's great to meet you both.
Yes, nice to meet you too.
So could you talk about, like, because you said when you first started writing, you were like, oh, I'll never write a romance, and you weren't really thinking about genre. And now you have these huge, you know, series. And could you just talk about, like, where you went from that point to that you know, the point of being in the genre space you are now?
Yeah. So after I published my first adult novel, my editor at Simon Schuster actually said, "Oh, have you heard of this new kind of category? I don't know if it's a genre, like called young adult." And she said, "We're kind of blowing up with it. There's a Gossip Girl just got published, a Sisterhood of Traveling Pants." And she said, "I think your voice would be really good for this genre." And I said, "Why?" So I'm very juvenile, you know. But it was funny. So it was kind of interesting. And I tell writers that, you know, kind of aspiring writers this, like sometimes you don't even know what you're good at, you know, and somebody else can see it in you and kind of steer you in that direction. So I'm always very grateful to her because she kind of saw that in me. She said, "You know, I think you should try to write for young adults, for this new genre that's kind of blowing up. I think you would be good at it." So I actually was on tour for my other book. It was a nonfiction book that I wrote with a friend of mine called How to Become Famous in 2 Weeks or Less, which started out as a magazine article, and we sold it as a book. And it was before reality TV. It came out in 2003. It was literally Paris Hilton, who was, how old was she? She was probably 19, and she hosted our book party. And she was, no, I mean, she was kind of like sort of famous, but not really, you know, so it was like we were right before the whole reality fame, which was funny. But so I was on tour for that book, and my editor told me, "Why don't you try writing for young adults?" So I started writing my first young adult book on the plane, and I remember cackling as I was writing it, and I was like, I was like, oh, this is really fun. Oh my God, she really knows my voice. And after I wrote that and sold it to Simon Schuster, I did not write anything else for 16 years. I only wrote for teens. So I just wrote all these young adult books, and then I wrote my first adult book again, 16 years later. So so it was really like being open to somebody's suggestion and also kind of realizing like, oh, I'm really good at this. Oh, this is really fun. So again, it was just easy, in a way. I mean, I really liked my adult book. It's a satire, which I think is really hard to sell. I didn't really realize it was sad. I was like, yeah, this is satire, but like, kind of embracing this more commercial, kind of like, but for me, easier way to write, and I don't think I would have done that if somebody had not said that to me. So I think I was lucky enough to have an editor who was sharp and saw something in my writing that said, oh, you might be really good for this genre, and then embracing it. So.
Wow, I love that.
Yeah.
Does someone have one other? Okay.
Hi, I'm Grania. Thanks for filming. I'm a TV writer, and something I found with original pilots or books, often the main character becomes the most boring character.
Yeah.
For some reason.
Yeah.
And I've been really thinking a lot about like how do you make main characters pop?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's actually really a good question. How do you make main characters pop? And I think like, we get so interested in the side characters, right? We kind of give them more personality, or they're like more likable, because we don't even want to like, there's something about that main character that's kind of scary. And I think maybe they're close to who we are, like, stand-in, because we're doing this right now with a TV show based on one of my books, and I keep on like feeling like apologetic. I'm like, yeah, I know, like she needs a little bit more, and I remember when I was writing those books, my editor said, the villain is so much more fleshed out, but we need the hero to be as interesting and as, captivating. And, she was kind of like, don't hold back. So I think it's hard to, why is it so hard to write likable people and good people? Like we're always so much more interested in the evil people and like the shades of evil, and like Maleficent is so much more fun and Descendants than boring King Beast. So I sympathize. I wish I had an answer. I'm actually also struggling with it, but I think like now that I'm older, kind of like realizing you can make your main characters more specific and maybe more interesting. I think we kind of, default to having them be these universal, every girl or every boy persons, because we want the reader or the audience to like really relate to them. So we kind of end up making them a little generic, out of that fear that, we're not going to have this huge audience relate to our main character. But I actually think the more specific and weird and interesting you make the main character, more people will actually like them. I hope that's helpful. Yeah. I'm going to use that. I'm like, ooh.
Yeah, we recorded it and we'll
let me know. What did I say?
Well, thank you so much, Melissa, for telling us about your
Thank you so much, guys.
And I did want to also very much thank Deborah Chow, who is our hostess this evening of Columbia College Women. And so I want to also do one thing. Melissa, can we get up and stand with the audience and hold up your book and take some photos?
Oh, yeah. Okay, some photos, yeah.